The smoke billowed on the horizon like an angry beast, rising in thick plumes that stained the clear blue Kansas sky. Hannah O'Connor stood frozen on the porch of her small farmhouse, watching in horror as the wall of flames devoured the drought-stricken prairie grasses, moving with terrifying speed toward the wheat fields that were her livelihood. It was the summer of 1871, and Hannah had never seen a fire move so fast. 3 years of backbreaking work on this homestead claim all of it about to be reduced to ash in minutes. Her father had died last winter, leaving the 22-year-old alone to manage their land. The wheat was nearly ready for harvest. It represented her only chance of keeping the farm for another season. "Dear God," she whispered, her hand clutching the wooden post of the porch. The hot wind whipped her copper hair across her face, the loose strands escaping from her hastily tied bun. The distant roar of the fire grew louder with each passing moment. Hannah snapped out of her trance and sprinted toward the barn. She had to save what she could. The mare, Penny, was whinnying frantically, sensing the approaching danger. Hannah threw open the barn door, rushing to untie the animal. "Easy, girl," she soothed, though her own voice trembled. She led Penny outside, quickly securing her to the hitching post by the well, as far from the approaching fire as possible. Hannah rushed back inside for the essential supplies she might salvage: the strongbox with her father's papers, their meager savings, and the silver locket containing her mother's portrait. As she emerged from the house, clutching her precious cargo, the air had grown thick with smoke and embers. The fire had reached the edge of her wheat field. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the golden stalks begin to blacken and curl. In mere minutes, everything would be gone. She couldn't bear to watch. Hannah turned to untie Penny, planning to ride to the safety of town, when a strange sound caught her attention: hoofbeats. Approaching fast from the east, through the haze of smoke appeared a rider, pushing his horse hard across the open prairie. Hannah squinted, making out the silhouette of a man on a powerful black stallion, riding directly toward her farm at breakneck speed. As he drew closer, Hannah could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a bandana pulled up against the smoke. He wore the practical clothing of a cattleman: faded denims, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. "Get on your horse," he shouted as he approached, his voice carrying over the growing roar of the fire. The winds shifted. "It's coming this way faster than you can outrun it." Hannah hesitated only a moment before grabbing Penny's reins. But as she moved to mount, a massive gust of wind sent a wall of embers sailing over the barn. In seconds, the dry wooden structure was ablaze, and Penny reared in terror, breaking free from Hannah's grip. "Penny," Hannah cried, watching helplessly as her mare bolted away from the flames, disappearing into the thickening smoke. The stranger was at her side in an instant, swinging down from his horse with practiced ease. "No time," he shouted over the roar of the fire. "The whole place will go up. We need to move now." Hannah stood frozen, watching as flames began to lick at the corner of her house. Everything she had worked for, everything she and her father had built, it was all being consumed before her eyes. The stranger grabbed her arm. "Miss, there's no time." Hannah clutched her small bundle of belongings to her chest, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "My farm." "It's just land," he said, his voice gentler now despite the urgency. "Land can be reclaimed. Lives can't." The heat was becoming unbearable. The fire had formed a semicircle around the property, cutting off escape in all directions except the narrow path the stranger had ridden through. Even that was closing rapidly. "Trust me," he said, his blue eyes locking with hers through the smoke. Something in his steady gaze broke through Hannah's shock. She nodded once, and in a swift motion, he lifted her onto his horse, swinging up behind her in the saddle. One strong arm circled her waist as he took the reins with his free hand. "Hold on tight," he instructed, turning the horse toward the diminishing path of escape. Hannah could feel the powerful muscles of the stallion beneath them as they thundered away from the farm. The stranger kept his arm firmly around her waist, his chest pressed against her back as they rode. The smoke swirled around them, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. She could feel the heat of the flames as they raced to outrun the advancing fire. "Keep your face down," he called over the roar. Hannah buried her face against the horse's mane, clutching her small bundle with one hand and gripping the saddle horn with the other. The world became a blur of heat, smoke, and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. She had no idea how long they rode, but gradually the air became clearer, the heat less intense. Finally, the stranger slowed his horse to a walk. Hannah raised her head, blinking away tears from her smoke-irritated eyes. They had reached a small creek, the water shimmering in the late afternoon sun. Behind them, a massive cloud of black smoke rose into the sky where her farm had stood. "We should be safe here for now," the stranger said, dismounting and reaching up to help her down. Hannah's legs trembled as her feet touched the ground. The full impact of what had happened hit her at once, and her knees buckled. The stranger caught her before she fell, his strong hands steadying her. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe." Hannah looked up at him, seeing his face clearly for the first time as he pulled down the bandana that had covered his nose and mouth. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and remarkably blue eyes that stood out against his smoke-smudged skin. His dark hair fell in disheveled waves beneath his hat. "I lost everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. Compassion filled his eyes. "Not everything, you're alive." He guided her to sit on a fallen log near the creek bank. "Rest here, I'll water the horse." As he led his stallion to drink, Hannah stared numbly at the bundle in her lap, all that remained of her life on the farm. She opened it with trembling hands, confirming that the strongbox and her mother's locket were still there. Small comfort, but something. The stranger returned, offering her a canteen. "Nathan Forrester," he said simply. "Most folks call me Nate." Hannah took a long drink of water before responding. "Hannah O'Connor, that was my farm," her voice caught. "My father's farm," Nate nodded solemnly. "I've been riding fence for the Double R Ranch about 10 miles west, saw the smoke and figured someone might need help." He looked at the black clouds still visible on the horizon. "Prairie fires are vicious this time of year, especially with the drought we've had." "The wheat was almost ready," Hannah said, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. "Without that harvest, I can't hold onto the land." Nate sat beside her on the log, giving her a moment with her thoughts. "You were working that spread alone?" he finally asked, his tone careful, neutral. Hannah nodded. "Since my father passed last winter, I was determined to make it work." She laughed bitterly. "Everyone in town said a woman couldn't run a farm alone. Guess they were right." "This wasn't your failing," Nate said firmly. "Fire would have taken that farm no matter who was working it." Hannah looked at him, struck by the certainty in his voice. There was no pity in his eyes, only respect, and somehow that made it easier to breathe through the grief. "You have family in town?" he asked. "Someone who can take you in?" Hannah shook her head. "No family, just some acquaintances." The thought of returning to Clearwater to face everyone's pitying looks made her stomach clench. "I don't know what I'm going to do." Nate was quiet for a moment, watching the creek flow past. "The ranch where I work the Double R, they might have a place for you. Mrs. Reynolds is always looking for help with the cooking and such. It's not much, but it would give you time to figure out your next steps." Hannah stared at him, surprised by the offer. "You do that, help a stranger," a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're not exactly a stranger anymore, Miss O'Connor, not after what we just went through." Something about his steady presence and the simple kindness in his offer broke through Hannah's shock. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were different tears of gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No need," Nate said, standing and offering his hand to help her up. "We should get moving if we want to reach the ranch before dark." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Hannah found herself once again seated in front of Nate on his horse, the solid warmth of his chest against her back oddly comforting as they rode west, away from the ruins of her past and toward an uncertain future. The Double R Ranch sprawled across the Kansas prairie, a collection of well-maintained buildings centered around a two-story main house. As they approached in the fading light, Hannah could make out figures moving about ranch hands returning from their day's work. "It's not much compared to some of the big spreads," Nate said as they rode into the yard, "but the Reynolds are good people." A gray-haired man emerged from the barn, eyeing them curiously as Nate helped Hannah dismount. "Forrester," the man called, "thought you were checking fence lines today." "Change of plans, Mr. Reynolds," Nate replied. "Prairie fire swept through east of here. Miss O'Connor here lost her farm. I was hoping Mrs. Reynolds might have a place for her." Reynolds studied Hannah with keen eyes, taking in her soot-stained dress and exhausted posture. His weathered face softened with sympathy. "Margaret's inside," he said, nodding toward the house. "She'll get you settled. Plenty of room since our daughter married and moved east." Hannah felt a rush of relief so profound it made her dizzy. "I can work," she assured him quickly. "I'm not afraid of hard labor." Reynolds' mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Never doubted it, miss. Anyone surviving out here alone has grit." He turned to Nate. "Get the lady inside, then see to your horse." Nate guided Hannah toward the main house, his hand lightly touching her elbow. "Mrs. Reynolds is a good woman," he said quietly. "Tough but fair, you'll be safe here." Hannah nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Forrester." "Nate," he corrected with a gentle smile, "and staying alive is thanks enough." The next few days passed in a blur for Hannah. Mrs. Reynolds, a practical woman with silver-streaked dark hair and quick, efficient movements, had indeed found a place for her, giving her the small bedroom that had once belonged to their daughter. In return, Hannah helped with cooking, cleaning, and the endless chores that came with running a ranch household. She saw little of Nate during those first days. The ranch hands typically ate their meals in the bunkhouse, separate from the main house. Occasionally, she would glimpse him working with the horses or heading out with the other men at dawn, but they exchanged no more than brief nods. On her fourth night at the Double R, Hannah sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of it struck her anew, even as it reminded her of the fire that had taken everything. "Mind if I join you?" Hannah startled at Nate's voice, turning to find him standing at the edge of the porch, hat in hand. His dark hair was damp, as if he'd recently washed, and he'd changed from his work clothes into a clean shirt. "Please," she said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Nate settled into it, placing his hat on his knee. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching the sky change colors. "How are you settling in?" he finally asked. Hannah considered the question honestly. "Better than I expected. Mrs. Reynolds has been kind in her way," Nate chuckled. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it." "She runs a tight ship." "I don't mind," Hannah said, surprised to realize it was true. "It helps to stay busy, keeps me from thinking too much about." She trailed off, unable to finish. Nate nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I rode out that way yesterday," he said gently, "to your farm." Hannah's breath caught. "Was there anything left?" "The stone chimneys still standing," he said, "and I found something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it out to her. Hannah gasped as she recognized the iron key to her father's toolbox. "How did you?" "It was near where the barn stood," Nate explained. "Thought it might mean something to you." Hannah took the key, running her finger over its familiar shape. It was such a small thing, insignificant really, but having this tangible piece of her old life brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." "Wanted to," Nate said simply. After a moment, he added, "I lost my family's ranch in a different way. Bank took it after my father died. I know what it's like to watch everything you've worked for slip away." Hannah studied him in the fading light. "Is that why you helped me? Because you know how it feels?" Nate considered this, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Maybe partly, but mostly." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "When I saw you standing there, refusing to leave even with the fire bearing down, there was something about your courage that made it impossible to ride away." Heat that had nothing to do with the summer evening rose to Hannah's cheeks. She looked away, suddenly flustered by the admiration in his gaze. "It wasn't courage," she said softly, "just stubbornness. My father always said it would be the death of me." Well, I'm glad it wasn't, Nate replied, a smile warming his voice. As darkness settled over the prairie, they talked for the first time. Hannah learned that Nate had been working at the Double R for nearly 2 years after drifting through several territories following the loss of his family's ranch in Nebraska. He spoke of his parents with quiet reverence and his younger brother, who had headed to California in search of gold. In turn, Hannah told him about growing up in Missouri, her family's decision to claim homestead land in Kansas after the war, and the difficult years working the farm with her father after her mother's death from influenza. Pa was determined to make something of our claim, she explained. He had such dreams for that land. What were your dreams? Nate asked. The question caught Hannah off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. I just wanted a place that was ours, she said after a moment. Somewhere permanent after years of moving around, somewhere I belonged. Nate nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's not so different from what most of us want. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mrs. Reynolds called from inside the house, reminding Hannah of her early morning duties. Reluctantly, she rose from her chair. Thank you again, she said, clutching the iron key. Not just for this, but for everything. Nate stood as well, towering over her in the darkness. Perhaps we could talk again tomorrow, he asked, an uncharacteristic hesitancy in his voice. Hannah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in days. I'd like that. Over the following weeks, Hannah fell into the rhythm of life at the Double R. The work was hard but satisfying, and the stability of meals, shelter, and modest wages helped ease the sting of her loss. What truly healed her spirit, however, were the evenings spent with Nate. They formed a habit of meeting on the porch after supper, sometimes talking for hours as the stars wheeled overhead. On Sundays, when chores were lighter, Nate would saddle 2 horses and they would ride the ranch's vast acreage. He showed her hidden meadows flush with wildflowers, a secluded pond where deer came to drink at dusk, and ridges that offered views stretching for miles across the Kansas prairie. Hannah found herself looking forward to these moments with an eagerness that surprised her. There was something about Nate's quiet strength and thoughtful nature that drew her to him. He listened when she spoke of her fears and dreams, offering neither judgment nor empty platitudes. He made her laugh with dry observations about ranch life and the quirks of the other hands. Most importantly, he saw her as she was not as a helpless woman to be pitied, but as a partner in conversation, worthy of respect. For his part, Nate seemed equally drawn to Hannah. His normally reserved demeanor softened in her presence. He sought out her company whenever his duties allowed, bringing her small treasures from his rides, an unusual stone, a hawk feather, once even a wild prairie rose carefully preserved in his saddlebag. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Hannah caught their knowing looks when Nate lingered at the main house, and Mrs. Reynolds raised an eyebrow more than once at their evening conversations. But no one commented directly, allowing their friendship to blossom without interference. As summer gave way to early autumn, Hannah found herself faced with a decision. She had saved most of her wages, accumulating enough to perhaps rent a small room in town and seek employment there. The logical step would be to move on, to begin rebuilding her independence. Yet the thought of leaving the Double R, of leaving Nate, filled her with a hollowness she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. One crisp September evening, Hannah sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air. Nate joined her, settling beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Penny Harvest Festival is next weekend," he said casually. "Thought you might like to go. The whole town turns out for dancing, food, that sort of thing." Hannah glanced at him, surprised by the invitation. "You're asking me to accompany you?" A flush crept up Nate's neck, visible even in the fading light. "If you'd like to," he said, his usual confidence wavering slightly. "As friends, of course." Something in his hesitation gave Hannah courage. "And if I'd prefer not to go as friends?" She asked softly. Nate's eyes widened, meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Hannah," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "I've been thinking about leaving," she admitted, watching his expression carefully. "Taking my savings and starting over in town." Pain flashed across Nate's features before he carefully controlled it. "That would be sensible," he said, his voice neutral. "You're certainly capable of making your own way." "Yes," Hannah agreed, "but I'm finding that what makes sense isn't always what the heart wants." Hope replaced the pain in Nate's eyes. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand, enveloping it in his larger one. "And what does your heart want, Hannah?" The directness of his question took her breath away. In that moment, looking into his earnest blue eyes, Hannah decided to be equally direct. "You," she said simply. "I want more evenings like this, more rides across the prairie, more of your stories and your laugh and the way you see the world." She took a deep breath. "I want you, Nate." For a heartbeat, he remained perfectly still. Then, with gentle deliberation, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. "I've wanted to hear those words since the day I found you standing in front of that fire," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "You were the bravest, most stubborn woman I'd ever seen, and I knew right then that you were someone special." Hannah leaned into his touch, her heart thundering in her chest. "So," she said, a smile playing at her lips, "about that festival." Nate laughed, the joyful sound carrying across the darkening yard. "Hannah O'Connor, would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the Harvest Festival, very much not as friends?" "I would be delighted," she replied, her smile widening. In the soft glow of twilight, Nate leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips. Hannah closed the distance between them, pressing her mouth to his in a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and possibilities neither had dared to hope for just weeks before. The Harvest Festival transformed the small town of Penny into a riot of color and activity. Bunting and lanterns hung from every available surface, and the town square bustled with vendors selling everything from apple cider to hand-carved trinkets. A makeshift dance floor had been constructed in front of the town hall, where a small band played lively tunes that had couples spinning and laughing. Hannah felt almost like a different person as she walked beside Nate, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Reynolds had helped her alter to fit properly, and had arranged her copper hair in soft curls that framed her face. Nate, dressed in clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a vest, had stared at her with such open admiration when she descended the stairs at the ranch house that Hannah had blushed to the roots of her hair. "You look beautiful," he'd whispered, offering her his arm with a formality that made her smile. Now, as they strolled through the festival, Hannah was acutely aware of the glances they drew. Many of the townspeople knew her from her time on the farm with her father, and word of the Prairie fire had spread quickly. Their curious looks held sympathy, but also questions about her relationship with the handsome ranch hand at her side. "Everyone's staring," she murmured to Nate. He squeezed her hand where it rested on his arm. "Let them," he said, smiling down at her. "I'm proud to be seen with you." The simple statement warmed Hannah more than the most elaborate declaration might have. She relaxed, allowing herself to enjoy the festivities, the sweet taste of cider, the cheerful music, the pleasure of being beside the man who had come to mean so much to her. As evening fell and lanterns were lit throughout the square, the band struck up a waltz. Nate turned to Hannah, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he led her to the dance floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while holding her other hand in his. "I should warn you," he said with a self-deprecating smile, "I'm not much of a dancer." "Nor am I," Hannah admitted. "We can be terrible together," but they weren't terrible. They moved well together, finding a rhythm that suited them both. Nate guided her with the same gentle confidence he showed in everything, and Hannah followed his lead willingly, trusting him as she had since the moment he'd carried her through the smoke. As they danced beneath the stars, Hannah felt a happiness she had not experienced in years, perhaps ever. The loss of her farm still ached, but it no longer defined her. Here, in Nate's arms, she had found something more precious than land or possessions, a chance at love, at building a future with someone who saw her strength and her vulnerability and cherished both equally. "What are you thinking?" Nate asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Hannah smiled up at him. "That sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we really need," understanding dawned in his eyes. Hannah, he began, his voice serious despite the festive surroundings. I know it's only been a short time, but a commotion at the edge of the square interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Raised voices cut through the music, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The dancers faltered, turning toward the disturbance. 3 men stood near the saloon entrance, clearly intoxicated and growing belligerent. One shoved another patron who had apparently objected to their behavior, sending the man sprawling into a display of harvest goods. Stay here, Nate said, his jaw tightening as he released Hannah and started toward the altercation. Hannah watched anxiously as he approached the scene. The sheriff was pushing through the crowd from the opposite direction, but Nate reached the troublemakers first. He spoke to them calmly, hands raised in a placating gesture. For a moment, it seemed he might defuse the situation. Then the largest of the drunken men took a wild swing at Nate. He ducked easily, but the man's companions joined the fray. In seconds, the confrontation had devolved into a brawl, with Nate caught in the middle as he tried to protect the fallen townsman. Hannah gasped as one of the men landed a punch that sent Nate staggering backward. Without thinking, she pushed through the crowd, reaching his side just as the sheriff and several other men managed to subdue the troublemakers. Nate, she cried, steadying him with a hand on his arm. Are you hurt? He touched his jaw gingerly, wincing. I'll live, he said wryly. Sorry about the dance. Despite her concern, Hannah couldn't help but laugh at his nonchalance. There will be other dances, she assured him, examining his face for injury. A bruise was already forming along his jawline, but nothing appeared to be seriously damaged. The sheriff approached them, hat in hand. Much obliged for your help, Forrester, he said gruffly. Those boys have been causing trouble since noon. Nate nodded. Glad I could assist, Sheriff. As the crowd dispersed and the band tentatively resumed playing, Nate turned to Hannah with a rueful smile. Not exactly how I planned this evening. Hannah shook her head, suddenly overwhelmed with affection for this man who had rushed to help a stranger without hesitation, just as he had done for her that day in the fire. I believe, she said, taking his hand, you were about to tell me something before we were interrupted. Nate's expression softened. Perhaps this isn't the right moment after all, he said, glancing around at the festival goers who were still casting curious looks their way. I disagree, Hannah said firmly. This seems perfectly fitting for us. Nate studied her for a long moment, then nodded, decision made. Leading her away from the main square to a quieter spot beneath an oak tree strung with lanterns, he took both her hands in his. Hannah O'Connor, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I know we've known each other only a short time, but in that time, you've become the most important person in my life. Your strength, your determination, your kindness, everything about you makes me want to be a better man. Hannah's heart raced as she recognized the significance of his words. I don't have much to offer, Nate continued. No land of my own, no fortune. Just my hands, my heart, and a promise to stand beside you through whatever life brings. He took a deep breath. If you'll have me, I want to build a life with you, a home, a family, a future. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, not of grief this time, but of joy. Are you asking me to marry you, Nathan Forrester? A smile broke across his face, transforming it despite the darkening bruise on his jaw. I am, though not as eloquently as I'd planned. I don't need eloquence, Hannah said, squeezing his hands. I just need your strength, your kindness, your unwavering support. Yes, Nate, yes, I'll marry you. The kiss they shared beneath the lantern-lit oak sealed a promise born in fire and nurtured through long evenings of conversation and growing trust. When they finally broke apart, Nate pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes shining with happiness. I love you, Hannah, he whispered. I think I have since I first saw you, refusing to abandon your home even with flames at your back. And I love you, she replied. For carrying me through the smoke, and for everything since. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Hannah O'Connor became Hannah Forrester in a simple ceremony at the Double R Ranch. Mrs. Reynolds had insisted on hosting the wedding, treating Hannah with the affection of a daughter as she helped prepare for the celebration. The ranch hands had constructed an arch of twisted branches in the yard, and Hannah walked toward it on Mr. Reynolds' arm, her heart full as she saw Nate waiting for her, tall and handsome in his best suit. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promising loyalty, partnership, and love through whatever challenges life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nate kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Hannah's eyes. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music and dancing lasting well into the evening. As the night drew to a close, Nate led Hannah to a wagon packed with their belongings. "Ready, Mrs. Forrester?" he asked, his eyes twinkling in the lantern light. "Where are we going?" Hannah asked, curious. They had planned to stay in the small cabin on the Double R property that Mr. Reynolds had offered them until they could save enough to purchase land of their own. "A surprise," Nate said, helping her onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. "One I've been working on for weeks." He guided the horses down the main road, then turned onto a smaller trail that Hannah didn't recognize. After about 2 miles, he slowed the wagon, turning to watch her face in the moonlight. "There," he said softly, pointing ahead. Hannah gasped as she made out the silhouette of a small cabin, windows glowing with warm light, smoke curling from the chimney into the star-filled sky. A porch wrapped around the front, and even in the darkness, she could see it was solidly built and well-tended. "Nate," she breathed, "what is this?" "Our home," he said simply. "Mr. Reynolds sold me the parcel 40 acres, including that stream we rode to last month. I've been working on the cabin whenever I could get away. Some of the boys helped." "It's not much yet," but Hannah silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she whispered, "It's perfect. Absolutely perfect." As Nate helped her down from the wagon and carried her across the threshold of their new home, Hannah thought of the day the prairie fire had surrounded her fields, how certain she had been that she had lost everything. Instead, that day had been the beginning of finding everything she had ever truly wanted: love, partnership, and a place to belong. In the years that followed, the Forrester homestead flourished. Nate's skill with horses and Hannah's knowledge of farming combined to create a modest but successful operation. They added to the cabin as their family grew, first with a son they named James, after Hannah's father, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's copper hair and their father's blue eyes. There were difficult times: drought years, harsh winters, the uncertainties that came with life on the frontier. But through it all, Hannah and Nate faced each challenge together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the prairie. Sometimes, Hannah would think back to that terrible day when fire had taken her first farm and marvel at how what had seemed like an ending had truly been a beginning. "No regrets?" Nate would ask occasionally, knowing the direction of her thoughts. And Hannah would lean her head against his shoulder, content in the life they had built together. "Not one," she would answer truthfully. "The fire took my past, but it led me to my future to you."